Hi, and welcome to Mental Ration, the channel where we take your mentality and rationalize it. Because it's a wordplay. See, it's like rational, but also like ration for the mind, like food. Food for thought. I need a better intro. The crazy stuff we've witnessed over the past year or so need no introduction. From polarization to a global pandemic to riots and protests everywhere. There's this word that's crept up in every single case though, a word that a few years ago was just hanging out in the backstage along with its other obscure friends like kerfuffle or, I don't know, winklepicker. I am of course talking about misinformation. And if misinformation is the big baddie behind pretty much everything that's gone wrong recently, why is it still a thing? Worse yet, why do people like it so much? Let's bite into this mental ration. Misinformation has been around for a very, very long time. It was used by the Soviet secret police as early as the 50s in the form of active measures, which is a fancy term for, well, fake news. This was used in situations from trying to stir up racial conflict by bombing black neighborhoods, then falsely blaming it on the Jewish community, to spreading bogus rumors that the US somehow engineered the AIDS virus in a lab. In fact, just in 2017, an anti-Islam and a pro-Islam Facebook page organized protests in Texas at the same time, in the same place. It was later found that these pages were controlled by Russian actors who intended to lead the two groups into a clash. Of course, it's not just Russia mounting these campaigns. Over 80 countries, including the US, UK, and China, have been found to employ such methods against adversaries of their own, but this is a special kind of fake news called disinformation. The basic way in which disinformation differs from misinformation is that whereas disinformation is planted with the explicit intent to divide and confuse, misinformation may be more naive and benign in its intention, but can be equally as destructive. For example, misinformation around COVID-19 has mostly stemmed from genuine citizen concern, but non-compliance has presented many challenges to many epidemiological teams in controlling the virus. It's this type of misinformation we're focusing on today, the genuine type, and especially why people tend to embrace it so easily. One of the biggest problems with misinformation is that people readily acknowledge that others are prone to it, but they're rarely able to see that they're also misinformed on various issues. In fact, you probably also clicked on this video to understand why others believe in misinformation, not you. See, we're quite drawn to misinformation. It's not just some random bots causing the issue. While bots definitely have some impact, even if we were to get rid of them, misinformation would spread about 6 times faster, wider, and deeper into networks than true information. Sure, some bots are out to get us, but the cold hard problem is this. We kind of like misinformation, but why? The misinformation effect, as it was called in the early days, first received significant psychological attention in the context of eyewitness testimonies. This is because under the right circumstances, people can genuinely come to recall things that never happened, because of the way in which a question is asked or the way in which secondary accounts of events are presented. Very briefly, if you show people videos of a car crash and ask them how fast the car was going when it smashed into the other, you will get higher speed estimates than if you ask them how fast it was going when it bumped into the other car. Manipulating wording like this can lead to some pretty bizarre cases, to the extent where people in the past have been implanted with false memories of being sexually assaulted, abused, or even witnessing murder. If you're wondering how stuff like this can devolve into the battleground that is 21st century social media, there's more. A 2017 study showed how easily the misinformation effect can be applied to situations where people want to believe a particular side of the story. The researchers got people who are either pro-police or anti-police and showed them body-worn camera footage of a police officer arresting what appeared to be an intoxicated man whose empty hands were clearly visible at some point in the footage. After watching the video, participants also read the police officer's report, in which he claimed the man was carrying a knife at the time of the arrest. People who were pro-police seemed to believe the officer's report despite having witnessed the arrest, which was not consistent with the officer's claims. Anti-police people, on the other hand, did not believe the officer. Even when witnessing an event, our predispositions and biases can massively affect how we remember that event, especially if we're not explicitly focusing on the details in the moment. Okay, then we have a confirmation bias. Can we educate ourselves out of it? Yeah, no, academics have tried that too. In 1979 and again in 2010 to be precise. Both times they showed participants supposedly real scientific studies which made conclusions about things like how effective capital punishment is, and then asked them to rate how sound their methodology was. Although the only thing the studies differed in were their results, the same biased way of thinking was observed. Studies that concluded what participants agreed with apparently had super sound methodologies. The others, although being exactly the same in every respect except for the results, didn't convince the participants, who all of a sudden were able to find tons of faults with their methods. Thus was coined biased assimilation, a favorable treatment of information we agree with and a more critical take on information we disagree with. Turns out that everyone could be just as prone to science denial as the next person. It's just that scientific findings can align with certain people's worldviews more often. Of course, some people are more biased than others, but we'll get to that in a bit. It looks like people believe whatever they want to believe, and sometimes they even remember stuff according to how they want to remember them. The reason behind this is pretty simple. Stuff we agree with is just easier to process. Whenever something is aligned with your worldview, it sits well and doesn't take much thought. When something goes against our worldview, however, it doesn't sit. We need to consciously think about it, and in doing so, we're also more likely to generate explanations against it. Whereas we lazily accept whatever doesn't catch us off guard, we're nowhere near as lazy when thinking about the stuff that we don't agree with. Of course, this means that people who are consistently more analytical are also more likely to pick misinformation out, although even they are prone to treating agreeable information more favorably. It's just as Cornell professor Thomas Gilovic wrote, "For desired conclusions, we ask ourselves, can I believe this? But for unpalatable conclusions, we ask, must I believe this?" What I've told you so far has probably just formalized what you knew already. People are biased. Here's where we get into the really juicy parts though. I'd like you to meet this guy. To you, he might seem like the average dorky guy you'd meet in, I don't know, dorky guy convention or something. In psychology circles, however, he's Stefan Lewandowski, which is his actual name on second thought, so I guess he's Stefan Lewandowski in every circle. Anyway, along with other psychology friends, he's published a whole lot of articles on why people buy into misinformation, but one of the biggest factors is this. Misinformation works because it fills gaps in people's understanding, but it does this in a narrative way that's super intuitive and easy to understand, albeit wrong. This means that it's not enough to just tell people they're wrong. This just reintroduces the gap, which is something people hate. Instead, you need to explain why the misinformation is wrong and provide details of what is instead the actual truth. In fact, people who have a high need for cognitive closure are some of the most misinformation-prone individuals out there. Need for cognitive closure is a fancy term in psychology to describe the phenomenon where people need to rationalize with why something happened to help them cope with it. As long as the event is explained away, it doesn't matter if the explanation is true or false. If they can't understand the proper explanation, then they'll just roll with the misinformation they can understand because, again, they don't care as much about being accurate as they care about just getting closure. If you're trying to debunk misinformation, you better make sure your explanation is easily understandable. Here's an example of debunking in practice. If you want to counter against the claim that vaccines cause autism with vaccines don't cause autism, that's like two goats going at it on a bridge. Your word's as good as mine. However, if you explain in simple terms that this rumor started from a since retracted research which only studied 11 children and failed all replication attempts, raising suspicions of fabricating data, that's probably more likely to get people thinking whether they're misinformed. You could also bring up the measles outbreak that followed the publication of the study, not to mention its author failing to disclose he was paid for his research by lawyers planning a lawsuit against MMR vaccine manufacturers, costing him his medical license. This is an intuitive answer because it explains where the vaccine autism claims stemmed from to begin with, why they're unfounded, as well as why they were made in the first place, because of a 400,000 British pounds worth of conflicts of interest, so that closes the gap. If you can't produce such an argument, make sure you're not the one who's misinformed, and also make sure your sources are verified and trustworthy. Now, this is a big one. Oftentimes when it comes to debunking or arguing online, it's a numbers game. Whoever can produce the most links to stuff wins. Research has shown that people apparently don't care much about the number of primary sources in support of a claim, just the number of secondary ones. This means that if 100 different scientists state that climate change is real, the gravity of this is pretty much the same as when 100 different news pages claim that climate change is not real, all citing the same scientist as their source. People don't look for scientific consensus, they just look for what's buzzing on the internet, false consensus if you like, and they don't just look for the mainstream stuff. On the topic of climate change, I know you're dying for another study, so here is one. In work that compared 45 scientific and 45 climate change denying blogs on the effect of climate change on polar bears, the authors found that the true scientific blogs referred to various peer-reviewed sources. On the other hand, a whopping 80% of the climate change denying blogs linked to the same website run by a person who, despite being a university professor, did not have any published works on polar bears, using that unverified website as a source for their claims. I previously mentioned that such misinformation spreads much faster and wider than true information, but let's briefly explain why. Accurate information needs to fit the true story of the matter. On the contrary, misinformation can be whatever the misinformer wants it to be, which is a huge advantage of fake news. A really interesting way of thinking about this, suggested by Thomas Hills, is looking at information in a way similar to natural selection. Some information survives and gets shared. Information which is not interesting enough just sort of dies off, at least in mainstream circles. But what makes information interesting? According to Hills, it's anything that's A, social, meaning information which others buy into, B, negative, meaning anything that draws our attention to scary or threatening possibilities, C, predictive, meaning information which connects some dots and helps us see patterns, even if none actually exist, and D, belief consistent, meaning, well, you know what that means, we've just talked about that. Take a look at the most prominent pieces of misinformation over the past year, and you'll notice all of them fit into all four categories. On the other hand, accurate information may state things like there is no evidence to establish a relationship between two events, or it may disrupt what people already believe, but all that's boring. It won't survive in the information environment, hence misinformation reigns supreme. Another huge factor is misinformation's novelty. People generally like things they haven't seen before, and so the novel way in which misinformation is presented makes it very attractive. In fact, the inoculation theory is based on this idea. Once again borrowing from biology, the inoculation theory states that we can protect ourselves against misinformation in a similar way as we would vaccinate against a virus by injecting ourselves with weakened forms of it. When people are presented with weakened or evidently less believable versions of misinformation, they can slowly begin to build immunity to it and become much better at detecting it when they come across it. Academics have actually developed a great game that you can play online to see this in action, where you try to make your misinformation as believable as you can to get as many followers as possible. I'll put a link in the description, be sure to check it out. Now, this video could go on for ages, but let's have a look at one final point. What I call the unholy trinity of biases that make misinformation attractive. These are the intentionality bias, the proportionality bias, and the side effect. The intentionality bias is basically what the name says. People tend to prefer explanations which involve intentional action rather than accidents. If a bar burns down, we might hear that it was a gas leak, but be unable to shake the thought that maybe the owner burned it down for the insurance money. The proportionality bias means that for major events, we seek proportionally major explanations to help us rationalize through it. The study that made the case for this bias found that people are more likely to attribute a conspiracy theory to a successful presidential assassination than a failed one, because if an outcome isn't big, neither is our explanation for it. You could apply the same logic to conspiracy theories about 9/11 or the JFK assassination, for example. Finally, the side effect is first of all a horrible, terrible, absolutely disgraceful name for a cognitive bias, and it means that people attribute more intentionality to negative side effects of one's actions than to positive ones. The reason behind why this happens is incredibly complex, and I might get to this in another video, but for now, just consider a maintenance worker who accidentally dropped something in a power plant generator. If the side effect of this is the power plant blowing up, people are much more likely to think that the worker sabotaged the system. On the other hand, if the side effect is positive, such as the generator becoming more efficient, most people will see it as what it is, a side effect, and will be very unlikely to think that the worker is a genius for fixing it. You can probably see why I call this the unholy trinity of bias. These three biases, and they're not even the only ones, make misinformation which targets specific organizations or individuals much more attractive and easy to adhere to. You can probably begin to see why so many people think the pandemic was engineered, or why claims of election fraud were so popular. They asserted intention on the part of some ostensibly evil entity. Here's a rule of thumb to help you out though. People in high places are much less intelligent than you think. A lot of misinformation revolves around putting high-profile people on a pedestal of craftiness, but the truth is, a vast majority of things that go wrong are genuine accidents. We're just biased against thinking that way. The plus side to this is that these biases can be used in countering misinformation themselves. For example, telling people about the doctor who intentionally fabricated vaccine data to make some bank is exactly the same line of reasoning as conspiracies on Big Pharma, and could work quite nicely in debunking. By now, it's pretty clear that "you're wrong LOL" won't get you far in changing people's minds. But more crucially, you need to understand two basic things. One, you yourself are misinformed much more often than you think. When someone is raising a point against your opinion, actually listen to them, but go on and fact check everything. You'll be surprised by how many holes you'll find in each other's argument. Secondly, even if you know for a fact someone is blatantly wrong, understand that people usually embrace misinformation not because they want to be accurate in what they believe, although they will often claim this, but because they're trying to fulfill another psychological need, like the need to understand why they've been locked in their homes for 9 months, or why some of them have lost their livelihoods. Your explanation needs to address that need, but to get there, you need to listen and understand what their need is in the first place. Keep that in mind, and you may see a huge change in how willing people are to listen to you. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it or learned something new and would like to see more content like this, please drop me a like, comment what you want to see next, and subscribe. See you next week.